we are going to continue our exchange towards a green economic recovery. As we all know by now, the current crisis has had and is having major impacts on worldwide public finances, in addition to slowing down the efforts of states to pursue initiatives towards sustainable development. So our next panel is going to bring together experts that will discuss how tax policy can support a green economic recovery. We will be joined by Paul Lanoie and by Himanshu Sharma. So I will introduce them, and then they will move forward with the panel. So Paul Lanoie is the Commissioner of Sustainable Development with the Office of the Auditor General. Monsieur Paul Lanoie est commissaire au développement durable depuis le 6 septembre 2016. Pendant plus de 27 ans, M. Lanoie a été professeur au HEC Montréal, où il a occupé des postes de gestion pendant la majeure partie de sa carrière. Il a notamment été directeur de la revue L'Actualité économique et directeur des affaires professorales. Ses qualités de leader l'ont ainsi amené à participer à l'élaboration du premier diplôme en développement durable de HEC Montréal, à la fondation de la direction du développement durable de cet établissement et à la création de l'Institut de l'environnement, du développement durable et de l'économie circulaire. Il a également contribué à la formation de la Commission de l'écofiscalité du Canada, où il a été nommé commissaire. Alors ça, c'est pour Paul. Merci beaucoup, Monsieur Lanoie, d'être avec nous aujourd'hui dans ce panel. Et Paul Lanoie sera joint également de Himanshu Sharma, qui était dans le panel précédent également avec les participants. So Himanshu is the manager of the Green Fiscal Policy Network, a collaboration between the IMF, UNEP, and GIZ to advance country dialogue and knowledge exchange on green fiscal policies. Previously, he worked with SNRS France, the World Bank, and the OECD on public policy issues across economic policy, financial regulation, and the environment. He holds a dual degree MPA from LSE and School of Science and Political Paris, and an MBA in International Business from BIMTech. So the floor is yours, and I will let you continue the conversation.
Bonjour, bonjour à tous. Donc, merci beaucoup de l'invitation. C'est vraiment un honneur là, de participer à cet événement. Alors, j'ai une présentation accompagnée d'un diaporama qui, j'imagine, va démarrer. Bon, parfait. Alors, donc, dans les 10 minutes qui viennent, je vais vous présenter une partie d'un rapport d'audit qui a été déposé en juin dernier au Parlement du Québec et qui porte sur les instruments économiques que sont l'écofiscalité, l'éco-conditionnalité et l'éco-responsabilité. On va passer à la prochaine diapo. Donc, quelques mots pour vous dire un peu quel est mon travail donc, au sein du vérificateur général du Québec. Donc, il faut savoir que le vérificateur général est responsable de l'audit financier, des états financiers donc, du gouvernement et des grandes sociétés d'État. Le vérificateur général est également responsable pour faire de l'audit de performance. Donc, il s'agit à ce moment-là de prendre une activité gouvernementale, un programme, une stratégie et vérifier si elle est bien gérée selon les principes d'économie, d'efficacité et d'efficience. Alors, moi, dans mon rôle, donc, à chaque année, je dois faire un audit de performance sur l'application de la loi sur le développement durable. Cette loi-là est importante au Québec. Elle a été adoptée en 2006 et elle s'accompagne à chaque 5 ans d'une nouvelle stratégie gouvernementale de développement durable, donc pour la mise en œuvre de la loi. Et cette stratégie-là prévoit que tous les ministères et organismes publics qui sont assujettis à la loi produisent un plan d'action de développement durable. Et la loi prévoit également que l'administration publique mette en application 16 principes de développement durable. Donc, ces éléments-là seront utiles pour comprendre ce qui vient. Donc, prochaine diapo, s'il vous plaît. Alors maintenant, on va entrer dans le vif du sujet. Alors, qu'est-ce qui nous a intéressés aux instruments économiques? Bien évidemment, chaque année, les ministères et organismes prélèvent et injectent des sommes d'argent importantes dans l'économie. Ces sommes d'argent, donc, peuvent être de puissants leviers pour changer les comportements, pour inciter les citoyens et les entreprises donc à faire mieux en matière d'environnement, et ce, en mettant en application donc des principes de la loi sur le développement durable qui sont importants, les principes pollueur-payeur et d'internalisation des coûts. Alors, j'imagine que vous en avez parlé à la séance précédente, mais essentiellement, l'idée ici, c'est que quand on pollue, il faut faire face au vrai coût de notre action. Donc, quand on conduit une auto, il y a un coût privé pour soi, mais il y a un coût social pour l'ensemble de la collectivité, que ce soit en matière de pollution, de gaz à effet de serre, et ainsi de suite. Donc, c'est important de faire face à tous les coûts donc, qui sont encourus par nos activités. Donc, c'est important que les pollueurs intègrent ces coûts-là dans leurs décisions. Et le gouvernement donc, du Québec, depuis plusieurs années, reconnaît l'importance des instruments économiques pour justement assurer ou appuyer une transition vers une économie plus verte et responsable. Et de façon plus spécifique, dans la stratégie gouvernementale actuelle qui couvre la période 2015-2020, on vise à accroître donc l'utilisation des mesures d'écofiscalité et à accroître donc l'intégration de mesures d'éco-conditionnalité et de critères d'éco-responsabilité dans les programmes d'aide financière gouvernementaux. Donc, on va continuer. Alors, juste des éléments de définition pour être certain qu'on se comprenne. Alors, l'écofiscalité, par ça, on va entendre donc des mesures économiques pour encourager donc les activités désirables pour l'environnement, décourager les activités qui sont nuisibles. On va avoir à l'esprit, bien sûr, des taxes comme une taxe sur le carbone, des tarifs, des crédits d'impôt, des consignes, aussi des droits d'émission qui peuvent être échangeables en vertu d'un marché du carbone. Et c'est justement un exemple qu'on donne ici. Donc, au Québec, on a un marché du carbone depuis 2013 qui s'appelle le SPED, donc le système de plafonnement et d'échange de droits d'émission. Alors, c'est sûr que donc dans les prochaines minutes, je vais mettre l'accent là-dessus, mais il ne faut pas oublier deux autres instruments possibles donc, qui vont donner des incitations financières à changer les comportements. Alors, on parlera d'éco-conditionnalité lorsqu'on a des aides financières gouvernementales qui sont conditionnelles au respect d'exigences de nature environnementale, en particulier dans le milieu agricole. Donc, il y a plusieurs programmes de financement qui sont conditionnels donc, à certaines activités de respect, donc de conformité à la réglementation, par exemple de produire un bilan en phosphore donc à jour et équilibré. Et on parlera de critères d'éco-responsabilité lorsqu'on aura des critères qui visent l'adoption de pratiques viables sur les plans économiques et responsables sur les plans social et environnemental. Donc, on parle alors de critères d'admissibilité, de critères de sélection ou de bonification. Un exemple qu'on donne ici, il y a un programme au Québec qui s'intitule « Réfection et construction des infrastructures municipales » dans lequel on prévoit une bonification financière lorsqu'on fait des constructions qui utilisent des structures en bois. Donc, on poursuit. Alors, pour le reste donc, de la séance, de la présentation, je vais me concentrer sur la fiscalité verte, donc l'éco-fiscalité. Et bien sûr, ben, comme on l'a mentionné, j'étais commissaire à la Commission d'éco-fiscalité du Canada. Donc, c'est clair que des exemples probants qui montrent que l'éco-fiscalité fonctionne, il y en a plusieurs. J'en donne 3 ici dans 3 domaines différents. Donc, en Colombie-Britannique, au Canada, donc, il y a eu une taxe sur le carbone introduite en 2008. Et entre 2008 et 2013, donc, cette taxe a entraîné une diminution de la consommation d'essence par habitant d'environ 7 %. En France, depuis longtemps, on a un système de bonus-malus pour l'achat de véhicules, donc, qui vise à favoriser le choix de véhicules qui émettent peu de CO2 et pénaliser donc les modèles plus polluants. Alors, depuis 2008, donc, ce système-là a contribué à une diminution d'environ 33% des émissions moyennes en termes de CO2 par kilomètre là, parcouru. De même, dans un autre domaine, soit celui de la tarification de l'eau, il y a Singapour qui présente un exemple intéressant. Entre 2000 et 2018, donc la tarification de l'eau a mené à une réduction d'environ 15% de la consommation d'eau par habitant. Donc, on y va avec la prochaine diapo. Alors, donc, le grand constat de notre rapport qui touche les mesures d'éco-fiscalité, c'est essentiellement que le recours aux mesures éco-fiscales au Québec reste limité et l'efficacité des mesures qui sont en œuvre est rarement évaluée. Alors, donc, on utilise peu ce levier-là pour influencer les citoyens et les entreprises. En fait, on a pu voir qu'il n'y a aucun des 106 plans d'action de développement durable qui sont en vigueur qui comporte donc une action qui vise l'ajout d'une mesure d'éco-fiscalité. Alors, il y avait un certain nombre de mesures en vigueur avant 2015 et qui étaient sous la responsabilité de différents ministères organismes, mais il n'y a aucun nouveau ministère organisme donc, qui s'est impliqué dans ce domaine-là. Donc, et ce qu'on a constaté aussi, c'est qu'il y a seulement 8 nouvelles mesures d'éco-fiscalité qui ont été introduites depuis le début de la stratégie actuelle, donc en 2015. Et ces mesures-là donc peuvent probablement avoir un impact assez limité, comme vous le verrez ici. Donc, il y a une des mesures qui a déjà été abolie. Certaines mesures vont avoir un impact financier marginal selon les chiffres fournis par le gouvernement. Une mesure ne va toucher que les véhicules de luxe électriques, donc très peu de véhicules. Et 2 autres mesures donc, sont là essentiellement pour une harmonisation avec la fiscalité au niveau fédéral. Donc, bref, l'impact de toutes ces mesures-là nous paraît assez limité. Et de façon plus globale, donc si on enchaîne avec la prochaine diapo, alors, on voit que le Québec utilise peu l'éco-fiscalité, donc les recettes qui proviennent de taxes liées à l'environnement, donc en proportion des recettes fiscales totales. Donc, il y a un graphique ici qui vous présente où se situe le Québec par rapport à l'ensemble des pays de l'OCDE. Donc, on voit qu'on est plutôt en queue de peloton. Et on poursuit donc avec la dernière partie de notre constat. Donc, on a peu de mesures qui ont été mises en vigueur et celles que l'on a sont rarement évaluées et révisées. En fait, près des 2/3 des mesures d'éco-fiscalité qui sont en vigueur depuis plus de 5 ans n'ont pas fait l'objet de révision donc, ces dernières années. Donc, on ne peut pas déterminer si elles sont encore utiles et adaptées au contexte actuel. Alors, quelques exemples à cet égard-là. On a, depuis 1992, donc une contribution des propriétaires de véhicules de promenade au transport en commun. Donc, le montant n'a pas changé depuis l'introduction de cette contribution-là. Il y a près de 30 ans. On a aussi des droits d'acquisition des matriculations additionnelles pour les véhicules énergivores. Ces droits-là sont imposés depuis 2005. Ils ont été modifiés en 2016, mais sans être évalués. Et en fait, on constate que même si la taille des véhicules en général augmente au Québec, il y a quand même moins de 10% des véhicules en circulation qui sont soumis à ces droits d'acquisition et d'immatriculation et il y en a moins de 1% qui étaient soumis au montant maximum. Alors, somme toute, je vais m'arrêter ici. Il y a encore donc pas mal de chemin à parcourir pour faire une bonne utilisation de l'éco-fiscalité au Québec. Alors, merci beaucoup et bonne continuation.
Alors, merci beaucoup à vous, M. Lanoie, pour avoir partagé avec nous, d'avoir fait le point sur les constats et les mesures d'éco-fiscalité dans le contexte de la relance économique. On va maintenant passer la parole à M. Himanshu Sharma. Himanshu is from the UN Environment Program, and we are going to hear his thoughts on how tax policy can support a green economic recovery. Hi, Himanshu.
Hello. I'll follow the excellent and technical remarks by Mr. Lanoie with a broad overview of where we stand and what we need. And I hope I'll be able to do justice to this essential issue. The world today finds itself in the worst financial and economic crisis in generations. The crisis has triggered an unprecedented policy response. Interest rates have been dramatically reduced, in some cases down to almost zero, and hundreds of billions of dollars in liquidity support and fresh capital have been provided to banking systems around the world. Moreover, governments are planning to deploy fiscal resources on an unprecedented scale. Does this sound familiar? This was the world in 2008-9, reeling from the effects of the financial crisis. Then, as now, there were calls for a global Green New Deal and recovering sustainably. Well, we all know how that went. The implications of postponing adequate climate and environmental sustainability action are clear. Had serious climate action begun in 2010, the emissions reductions required per year for the 1.5 degree scenario in 2030 would only have been 3.3% per year on average. Now, the required cuts in emissions are 7.6%. We need a green recovery because nature has suffered a pandemic-like crisis for over a century. Human activity has accelerated the rate at which plant and animal species are becoming extinct by a factor of over 100. The science is clear that if we keep exploiting wildlife and destroying our ecosystems, then we can expect to see a steady stream of zoonotic diseases, a category that COVID-19 belongs to, jumping from animals to humans in the years ahead. We need a green recovery because over half of global GDP is dependent on high-functioning biodiversity and ecosystem services. I know it feels like things couldn't get worse, but the loss of life and economic misery would be truly existential if we do not take necessary action on climate, nature, and pollution. By 2100, climate change could be 5 times as deadly as COVID-19. In addition, in the next decade or two, the economic damage caused by climate change will likely be as bad as having a COVID-sized pandemic every 10 years. But announced stimulus to date will have a net negative environmental impact in 16 of the G20 countries and economies. Of total quantified green stimulus, only 2.8% was directly related to improving biodiversity or preserving ecosystems. A green framing for relief and recovery stimulus measures is imperative to build system resilience, support public health efforts, and reduce the probability of future pandemics and wider-ranging environmental and climate change risks. Greener fiscal spending can create an average of 9 to 10 jobs for every million spent, compared to between 5 jobs for the same amount of investment in traditional infrastructure. And for every dollar spent on nature restoration, there is a 9 times return on investment. But there are very real constraints on budgets due to the drastic collapse in private investment and tax revenues. Most low-income and developing economies had limited fiscal space to begin with, only to see it collapse beneath the global impact of COVID-19 on commodity prices, tourism, remittances, and capital flows. This epidemic threatens not only a large health and economic crisis, but also a prolonged debt crisis. Default risk makes lockdowns more costly because they limit the fiscal capacity of governments to support consumption. These additional costs from default risk in turn result in a deeper health crisis with more lives lost to the epidemic. An important point is that I want to not advocate for fiscal austerity, but rather ensure that investments in newly issued debt, if necessary, is used to raise the green growth rate rather than for investing in dirtier and traditional infrastructure. Green fiscal policy reform can be an important element in a government's response toolkit for COVID-19 relief and recovery, as it can support countries in rationalizing inefficient expenditures to create valuable fiscal space and enable smarter management and reallocation of scarce public resources to priority sectors. This is an opportunity to reform environmentally harmful and inequitable subsidies, replacing them with more direct payments that support the incomes of vulnerable workers or communities while reducing government outlays. For example, phasing out the over $478 billion per year in subsidies to fossil fuel use is a massive opportunity. Not only would it free up resources to invest in a green recovery, it would incentivize a behavioral shift in household and business towards more sustainable consumption and production. We can also internalize externalities, be it health, climate, or pollution costs, if we really want an inclusive green future and accept that there are planetary boundaries. For example, if you let meat and dairy cost what they really should, a family of 4 having a meal at McDonald's would be paying $100. We can also join the 77 countries states or cities now applying a price on carbon globally, covering about 20% of global emissions. Or if a broad carbon pricing is infeasible, fee-based offer a possible alternative. These approaches can raise funds for cash-strapped governments, be done in a way that ensures low-income and vulnerable households are better off, and would allow countries to step up their climate ambition. This is also a moment to look at options to shift taxes away from things that we want to encourage, like employment, and towards those we don't like, for example, pollution, especially when implemented as part of a wider policy package that also reduces other taxes on productive activities. Green fiscal instruments have the potential to support an immediate increase in job creation and demand to increased household disposable income, while at the same time providing powerful incentives for increased investment and activity in green economy sectors for businesses and individuals. Our social and economic fate is inextricably linked to that of nature. In solving one crisis, we cannot ignore another. There is an opportunity to act decisively now to prevent irreversible damage to nature and dramatically lower future costs of protecting the planet. Thank you for having me here and allowing me to present these thoughts.
Thank you so much, Himanshu, for sharing your thoughts with us and reminding us of the importance of a true green economic recovery this time around, including incentivizing behavioral shifts. I will now pass the microphone to Karine Péloffy. Karine was with us just previously, and she will continue as a moderator to unearth and to outline positive and sustainable ways forward. Karine is a Parliamentary Affairs Advisor in Canada since 2019. She holds a Master of Science in Environmental Change and Management from the University of Oxford in the United Kingdom, and she was the Director of the Quebec Centre for Environmental Law from 2014 to 2018. On to you, Karine.
Thank you very much. I see some familiar faces from last session. So for those who were not there, I won't retell everything that happened. It was great. But we did play into a bit of the topic of this session and straight away a bit from the international cooperation aspect. So I allow you to cheat and go back to the international aspects in this session if you would like. We ended the last session with the open question of, does someone have an idea of an Apollo project, something that seems crazy, but the crazy idea itself makes the impossible possible. And I'm very thankful that Tasnim has volunteered to give us a couple of success stories and some developing country perspectives on this. Thank you very much. And I encourage you for this to be a lively discussion. Please raise your hands, send me a message if you want to talk. Let's keep it flowy and organic like last time. Thank you.
So I will speak, right? Yes. Hello from Dhaka. It's almost midnight in Bangladesh. So jumping on the discussion, as I was following the previous session, I would like to share one thing. Like as you all know, Bangladesh is the biggest victim of climate change, and also we are one of the emerging markets in the world. And in this pandemic, we are also coping with the situation right now. And we all know, yesterday we saw the IMF forecast, and last week the World Bank's forecast about the GDP and everything. And as we are a developing country, and we focus on investments, like many other South Asian countries, we so climate change and the green economic recovery is a very important factor in this situation in the time of pandemic. And what comes us while I work for the government of Bangladesh in fiscal policy regime, so I can tell you that we are also worried. And previously we don't know about all this pandemic and everything, but as we are the second largest RMG exporters of the world, we tried to introduce a fiscal incentive to the RMG sector back in 2017. And like our corporate tax rate in the RMG sector is very reduced as we try to attract investments. So we introduced that if a company becomes internationally certified environment-friendly company, it will pay 2.5% less than the reduced tax rate. And the result is, I don't know, maybe with the help of European Union and the customers of European Union, because maybe they are more reactive to the situation of environment-friendly aspects, and they are also, the EU also helped with an alliance to see how the compliance issues and everything in the factories going on. So with the reduced tax rate or the incentive-based tax rate, Bangladesh right now has the highest number of internationally complied and internationally friendly garments factory in the world. So that's the success story. And my question, as we are developing country and the whole world is seeing this pandemic and everything, I don't know, because we are not responsible for this climate change and the carbon emission. The developed world is responsible. How it will be shared by everyone and it will go to the climate fund and everything. Thank you.
I will refrain from making editorial comments about Canada's historical responsibility and failure to act on this, and leave the floor to Santiago, who wants to follow up with this.
Yes, thank you, Karine. I was wondering that from the discussions, and I congratulate all those involved in the last panel that are here and those that left. It was really boarding those issues that really matter. And my only twist is that I think we need not to talk anymore about fiscal reform. We need to talk. If we want to address the biodiversity crisis, the climate crisis, and the inequality crisis that we are in globally, and in each country, but also globally, we need really an ecological and socially fair transition. And that means we need a fiscal transition as well. If we analyze how the world we want should be, there is a lot of landslides in all the economic structure that require really a new focus on how fiscality will be. And that means really taking it not as a reform, but really understanding where we want. We come from a very concentrated, socially concentrated reality, and from an ecological disaster, and we want to address those in the future. We need to understand what are impacting all that those issues that are really misguiding the acting of fiscal authorities, and really to understand where we want to go, and maybe a transitional plan, because fiscality is very sensitive. If you make a bad plan from year to year, you can lose a lot of money, and you can really get out of the possibility of using public funds for action. So we need that. And also understand another issue that has happened. We have witnessed how for this recovery from the COVID, different countries have different capacities, and yes, the fiscal space is lost. Why? Because globalization has make the economy, the world, the place for the economy, but fiscality is still national, and there is no large coordination, global multilateral coordination, and that make all rush to the bottom to attract investments. And we have tax havens, we have a bad architecture for sovereign debt. All of that has shrink the fiscal space for most countries. So we need also to address that. So the fiscal transitions needs to happen at the national level, but we need also a global effort. In the last panel, we're talking about the OECD. The OECD is limited. Yes, we need a UN convention. And I agree, because some of you mentioned that conventions are so slow in taking decisions, in reaching good agreements, and usually is the less the less aspiration, the less ambition that wins. So we need to take care about that and how to embrace it. So I don't have the answers, but I think the approach needs to be really about a fiscal transition, a global and national level fiscal transition that it addresses all of that. Leave it there. I come back later. Thank you.
Would somebody like to bounce off exactly this intervention? Otherwise, we have, you were the next in line. Ali, go ahead, please. Ali? Okay.
Yeah. Hi, everyone. It's also night here in Marrakesh, in Morocco. That's really great what you shared, Tasnim and also Santiago. I can really relate to that. I also think that looking specifically at tax reform as a means to change our whole approach to fighting climate change and moving towards the green recovery is a difficult path, because we're talking about punitive approaches to pollution, to bad practices, and you are not shedding the light enough on the value of a clean environment and doing things the sustainable way. So Santiago talked about the dangers of biodiversity. There is a lot of that biodiversity faces. There is a lot of positive approaches that can come in from the source rather than the tail end of what causes environmental damage and then impacts us all as humans, like the COVID crisis. We can do a lot of good in terms of evaluating what is the value of the environment, ecosystem services, and establish payments for ecosystem services right at the beginning. So we have very good examples of how Costa Rica switched its entire economy based on that recognition. And this is really great. Even in their trading balance, they went from normal trading patterns from developing countries to importing what is bad and limiting their carbon footprint by producing clean energy. And they are the main exporters now of a lot of sustainable products, which is great. I can also relate what Tasnim said, because and the situation of Bangladesh, because I've worked mostly in African countries, including my own, and we have been faced with this kind of taxes, but also with poverty and the need for job creation. So what happens is when we get a lot of foreign companies that come here and do the work, we are obligated to have very flexible and generous tax benefits to them, or else they can just go to tax haven. So there is a lot of loopholes that already exist in this kind of tax systems. So just coming and throwing new green packages and quality control is very, it creates mixed feelings, because the current tax systems haven't given us any kind of satisfactions. Those who are in power, close to decision makers, have the most money, they always find a way to evade. There was an interesting point made by a representative from Sweden in the previous panel, where she talked about how Facebook created the data centers by looking at where was the cheap electricity at. And so this is something that could happen overnight. So basically, I think that finding alternative solutions, there was also something very, very good said in one of the presentations, where we could look into how do we call it, maybe changing also the way finance is handled, providing, because businesses begin from financing. And so if we have green finance, then they can link it to a lot more eco-friendly practices. They can favor the development of some businesses, and they can really leverage a lot of transition within specific industries, especially those that pollute the most. But to finish off about the whole global system, I think Santiago is right. A global convention, we have to have something like that in terms of green fiscal system, because we can't input any kind of sovereignty or limitations to pollution or to environmental damages. The COVID-19 virus didn't stop at any jurisdiction or customs, neither does pollution. So countries that have lowest emissions, they do less. And we really need to think about that. Look at things from the source and maybe put it into a wider framework. It's more difficult because these kind of conventions, like UN conventions, are very difficult to put in place. And we need the right people sitting at the table, because we remember the Kyoto Protocol and how not having the US at the table didn't do much impact. And we have the same things for conventions on biological diversity and such. So this is something that I really have to see. How do we get big decision makers, the bigger countries, to sit at the table to come up with this global tax system maybe, or something like that? And how also do we involve local authorities? Because they are the ones, the main enablers. They are the ones who actually handle the cities, the buildings, the local populations. They can identify the sources. And are these people enabled or not? And I think this is something really important to consider.
Thank you very much. I believe Himanshu wants to respond directly to this, and then we will go to Marta, who had a question as well.
Thank you. Just wanted to make a small comment on the issue of green finance. While I agree that we need more green finance, I don't really agree that the issue is the availability of financing. So there is ample liquidity out there looking for yield. The issue in most countries is actually having projects which are green, because the green in the finance is not because of the source of finance, but the projects that it finances. And in all the countries that we work with, that's been the issue, that there's not enough bankable projects on the ground that this finance could go to. I mean, if you look at ESG or the issuance of green bonds, there's already a lot of capital flowing into greener sectors. So I think that's an area, capacity building in countries where they understand how to structure projects, how to make them bankable, and more public investment support to de-risk these projects. But I think for the availability of capital question, I don't think that is an issue, at least for green finance.
Would somebody like to reflect on that before we go to Marta? Going once. Grant, please. Yes. And Ali wants to talk as well.
Yeah, just to pick up on a couple of points from the prior two speakers, from a city perspective, so I'm with the city of Pittsburgh in the US, and one of the things that often is frustrating for us at the city level is to hear about the multinational conversations and the inability to come to consensus, where much of the action really takes place at the local levels. Whether that is, to Ali's point, kind of the need for implementation, or to Himanshu's kind of point about the need for financial structures. And what we've seen in the global system is the lack of attentiveness to those needs, both in terms of kind of the structures and the processes, as well as to the products and services. If I could, though, just to reflect a bit on the role of the green recovery and kind of where we've been positioned here. We're experiencing these twin challenges of really prior to the pandemic, of climate and inequality. And when we look through kind of these lenses, effectively what we experience is shocks like the pandemic are force multipliers on these stressors like climate and inequality. And the tectonic plates of urbanization, globalization, and climate change have basically confluenced at this moment. And what that means at the local level is that we're seeing a precipitous decline in revenue. So right now, as a relatively small city, we're experiencing a $100 million gap in our budget as I speak to you right now. So going from this call to a budget call talking about layoffs and potential personnel moves that we're going to have to make because of this global challenge that's been imposed upon us. And so what that really necessitates is the ability for us to have both agility and acceleration around a lot of the implementation of our climate and justice strategies that at the local level, we have been working hard to develop, but haven't had the tools from our state, provincial, or national partners. And so what we are trying to do to basically at least try to do our part is effectively take those plans and strategies around climate and justice and mold them together, because effectively they become the ability to create kind of force multipliers themselves in terms of a positive transition. The second is to start to kind of design the policies that we can control. So whether that's local forms of taxation or with regards to building codes and different things that local governments can influence to start to help accelerate that transition. This final two pieces are really around procurement. How do we leverage those assets that are within our capital and operating budgets? So even as a small city, the city of Pittsburgh controls about $700 million annually from our operating and capital budgets. Similarly, we've seen the same type of opportunities, and just to follow on Himanshu's point about ESG, in using and leveraging our pension funds by developing ESG policies for those pension funds. So typically what happens in that case, and these are a really great example of our resources or local communities go up and evaporate into the ether of global finance. And very rarely does that capital metastasize itself back into influencing projects on the ground that can change our grid, clean our water systems, make our safer roads and bridges, build more affordable housing, the things that communities need. Instead, they find themselves into private equity funds or other sources of global capital that are making investments halfway around the world. And one of the things that we've started to do, and I'll just leave with this comment in terms of the earlier setup about what are some of the catalytic things that we might do, is that we're starting to band together with other cities in our region. So connecting with other mayors in the Ohio River Valley, in Pennsylvania, Ohio, West Virginia, Kentucky, who have been at the basis of the fossil economy. So oil, just for folks, was discovered in Titusville, Pennsylvania, 60 miles northeast of Pittsburgh. And so we have a responsibility to help solve what we let out of the ground in many cases. And so it's finding ways in which to invest in the human capital as well as the physical capital that can help facilitate that just transition. And one of the things that we've called upon is to use a term from the mid-20th century, is a Marshall Plan for Middle America. So effectively calling upon the need for major capital investment to help rebuild infrastructure, both in terms of mitigation of carbon emissions, but also more importantly, adaptation. So just in the last 2 years, we've experienced 2 times our normal amount of precipitation, which has basically challenged us to invest 15% of our capital budget to remediate landslides, floods, and other results of precipitation. And that's a major impact on local governments. So just wanted to kind of provide those perspectives in terms of what we're seeing on the ground with a small American city.
I saw a lot of nodding heads, so that sounded like a bit of global consensus. Just trying to find balance between those who raise their hands live and those who do so privately in the chat. I think the order, and to do some gender balance as well, we will go to Marta, Jacqueline, Elena, then Ali, then Santiago. So just quickly, Marta, Jacqueline, Elena, Ali, Santiago.
Yes, thank you very much, Karine. I would like to put on the table some other issues. I agree of all that Grant say, and of course Santiago and the rest of the speakers. But I think it's important to put on the table strategies, timing issues, plans, and so on, because if we need to move our current economic industry, for example, I'm thinking in Spain about our car industry, which is very, very important as our tourism. If we should move to a model more green, which mean electric cars, for example. We need to planify. We need to know which one could be help or not. And we need to prepare all the agenda needed, because we need also money and resources for infrastructure, for changes in electricity, because we are talking here about green economic recovery. But let me remind that the European strategy is to move to a green and digital new area. And then we should take into account that our resources should be conditioned to the green, to the ones that have future in terms of employment too. I have a lot of things in my head, but I don't want to use my time anymore.
We will now go to Jacqueline, and I saw you, Antoine.
I'm doing exactly the opposite to what Marta just did, opening up to say we need to think about planning. I agree with what everyone has said. But one thing that I wanted to comment on very much was when Ali was talking about punitive approaches and moving away from those when we're talking about how to realize a just transition or a green and just transformation. And I wanted to just mention at this point, I think the framing of tax policy is really important, and we shouldn't be talking about tax policy as something that's punitive, but we need to explore how we can discuss tax in the most possible way, in the most positive way that we can for the people that we're trying to address, for the electorates that we'd like to convince of the good reasons to implement a particular tax. You know, we know that, or a lot of us, I'm sure, have heard the citation that taxes are the price we pay for a civilized society. We all, you know, we know that it's a fundamental part of our social contract. And what we need to think about is how to communicate about taxes as being fair, making sure that they're transparent, making sure that we can build trust, that when we say revenues will be used for a certain thing, that they are used for that purpose. So I think that's something that we shouldn't forget. Obviously, taxes can be perceived as punitive, but that's not their intention at all, and it shouldn't be taken as such. Okay, I'll stop there because there's a lot of people to come in.
Marta, did you want to
yes, just to add that this system or title like bonus malus is very well understood by citizens, and I think it's a good way to explain how tax incentives, how taxes are integrated with the regulatory system and subsidies. That's all.
Okay, now Elena, Ali, Santiago, Antoine.
I just want to say I love the Jacqueline intervention, and I also dream of a future where everybody will be happy to pay taxes and proud of it. But I mean, we can only dream for the moment. But I really wanted to make more of a comment about the fiscal dimension of the problem, and to think about something that Himanshu, I think, mentioned in the opening remarks. Part of the opportunities that lie in environmental taxation, and in particular, for example, in carbon pricing, is really that these tools can expand the fiscal space. And that is very important, especially for countries that don't reach that 15% tax to GDP threshold, which is commonly considered as the minimum for development, or I mean, sometimes even 20% is considered the minimum for sustainable development. And there are some estimates from the OECD, I think, which say that a 30 euro per ton carbon tax or carbon price would allow a global increase in revenues of 1.3%. And that is huge if you think in a space of countries which do not reach 15% of revenues, actually sometimes they're closer to 10%. So I think that is extremely important. On the other hand, we also have to to think about, all these estimates that are made. First of all, what is the difference between different countries? Different countries, of course, would make different contributions to this theoretical 1.3%. There are some estimates that say if we raise carbon pricing to €75 per ton, we can eliminate completely we can reach the Paris Agreement by 2030. But then the question is really, how feasible is that? Nevertheless, I do think that increasing the fiscal space is a very important component of this type of measures. And the other important component is that really these measures provide opportunities for broader governance and improving in broader governance. Starting from the fact that often these measures are managed between different governmental entities, and so they really allow to break down silos. They can allow to streamline administration in some cases. And building on the points that several people made on local authorities versus national authorities versus the international framework, I think it's really important to think to establish one point, which is that in the end, taxing rights belong to the country, to the state, and it's not through international agreements that we can establish domestic taxing rights. However, once we have established at which level these taxing rights are within the government, within the country, international agreements do provide a huge opportunity for establishing guidances and best practices, and in the end to really establish a blueprint for countries to follow and to reach a more global and shared solution. So that's all from my side.
Himanshu, was that a hot pursuit you wanted, or do you want to just go at the queue?
No, I just wanted to actually highlight the fiscal space issue with some numbers. So we're going to be releasing soon Inclusive Green Recovery Observatory, which is tracking the 50 largest economies and assessing the environmental impact of the stimulus spending so far. And what we found was that on an average in advanced economies, the fiscal stimulus has reached around 20% of GDP, whereas in low income and middle countries, it's less than 2% of GDP. So that's just to highlight the lack of fiscal space between the advanced economies and the low and middle income countries. Just wanted to substantiate the point that Elena made.
Thank you very much. Now we go to Ali.
Yes, this is great. What Elena just said, it's very important that we also keep in mind that there is sovereignty involved in terms of fiscal system. So maybe perhaps the solution is more of a global harmonized tax approach rather than a strict carbon tax convention. That would be difficult because each country could then control a little bit its revenues and do it. The other thing about the taxes is the impact that it will have when you apply them. Usually it's onto the consumers. So there needs to be a really good strategy to ensure that if we impose taxes on certain industries and then it's reflected on products, then it's going to be reflected on the consumers. If it's going to help them reduce their consumption of those specific products that are basically not eco-friendly or environmental friendly, then maybe yes. And then also, how long will that take? So this is why I was making the maybe harsh point about punitive measures. Of course not, but we don't really think about too many positive things when we think about taxes. But it is a reality, and also the question of governance. This is something that encompasses all kinds of vertical hierarchical structures and administration. It goes from side to side at the global level. It touches local communities. So there also needs to be new governance approaches in terms of how we tackle those very, very horizontal issues at multiple level. And this is something even that when Himanshu earlier mentioned that financing is not a problem, he is absolutely right. There is money, but it's about the governance, about how these things are structured. Access to finance is the problem, not the finance itself. It's and we need to have a common understanding of how we can deal with these green reforms, so that you explain it from developing countries to developed countries, from the international level to the national level to the local level. Like Grant was saying, these were great example about Pittsburgh, but in order for it to be replicated, they need to be adapted, because each little town has its own reality, its industry has its own reality and needs. We just heard about the car industry in Spain. I could talk about tourism or fisheries in Morocco. It's the same aspect. They need financing, but they really need proper governance. And flexibility in maybe a harmonized global tax approach rather than system, because I think that will be difficult to implement.
Jacqueline, is that a hard pursuit or Q?
A little bit. I'll be very quick. Just on the harmonization point, I think it's a really interesting idea. The European Union's been trying to revise its harmonized energy tax, the Energy Tax Directive, for about 10 years now, and has not yet managed to agree a second step. But I agree in principle that if you can have something where you say there's a, let's say, minimum carbon price, perhaps what we could strive for, minimum carbon price, G20, smaller group of countries, and then perhaps you can get over this sovereignty and tax issue. But I think harmonization is the way forward, but it's also not necessarily easy, just to flag that up, because there's...
And Tasnim, was that a hot pursuit or to the queue? Hot pursuit?
Yeah, I mean, just because the discussion is going on about the harmonization, from practical aspect, I think demographic diversity around the world. I mean, if you see Latin America, if you see Africa, if you see Indian subcontinent, the diversity in demography and the tax education, everything depends on the, I mean, everything should be considered on the harmonization aspects of introducing green economic reforms around the world. And I don't know how we're going to go on those stages, as tax GDP ratio and everything is not the same in most of the developing countries as well, and also in the developed countries as well. The ratio is different. The economic diversity, socioeconomic condition, and the demographic aspects. Like in India, if you see the socioeconomic aspects in India, in Pakistan, in Bangladesh, is different. Like not like Europe, not like Africa. So the harmonization, I don't know. I want to know more about it.
We'll hold that thought for just 1 second. I will go back to the normal queue just out of fairness. So Santiago, Antoine, Quentin. But do raise your hand if you feel excited about hot pursuing.
I will go back to some experience, the recent experience we have with the recovery packages we saw in Climate Action Network International, where we work, that this is the decade for climate action, and all this money that will pour into the system will never be there in this decade. So if it is not aligned with the climate action, we're lost. So in that sense, we start working on bailouts, conditionality, etc. But the reality is what Grant and Himanshu said. There is no fiscal space on to do anything, even bailouts, etc. So from thinking on the environment, we start thinking more on the fiscal space, and tax havens and sovereign debt are really big issues that we need to address. And then obviously, if you want to put some environmental taxes, you know that they fade out over time. So you need also to understand the dynamic, and you need to bring all other measures, compensatory, and as Grant said, you need to invest, and I mean Himanshu as well. You need green projects to make the alternatives clear and real for the people to change to change the uses, the traditional purchases, etc. So to address the big issues that we have on biodiversity and climate and inequality, you need the possibility for countries to invest, and we don't have that now. So in this sense, we have we develop a paper on who pays the bill of COVID-19 recovery, and we start with some measures, and carbon pricing is one, the financial transaction tax is another, we have the climate damages tax that has been developed from some members, etc. We have all that, but we also are addressing that we need a big conversation on the last 40 years of an economic model that really shrink public finance. The health systems are neglected, are abandoned because of that, and we need to recover that, the capacity of that. And then it's true, we need money to trigger and leverage private sector money. Green finance is there are resources, we don't have projects, but also we need to understand that some projects require some public money, that addressing the externality, the negative externality, is a common good. So even that some private sector make money from addressing something with public money as a guarantee, the guarantee, what guarantees is that you are addressing a negative externality that is a public good. I leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you, Santiago. We have a hot pursuit from Himanshu, and then we'll go to Antoine, Quentin, and Elena.
Yeah, just wanted to reiterate that the issue of fiscal space is very specific to low-income and middle-income countries. So for the advanced economies, they have ample fiscal space. And there, the issue really is how they use that fiscal space. Are they going to make the massive stimulus that they can enact in ways that will advance us to a green economy, or would it put us back? So far, we haven't seen a lot, at least not on the scale that we need. But this is an important distinction to make, because also the scale of stimulus that will be enacted also will determine what the impact will be. So in a sense, what I'm saying is that the advanced economies, they have a chance now to lead the world and show the way. The European Commission has done so, but with other countries, it's still an open question.
Antoine, then Quentin and Elena.
Yeah, I wanted to bounce off of Marta's point from now a long time ago, but you kind of brought back those subjects, especially Himanshu and Santiago. What I wanted to talk about, and which is probably mostly a rich country issue, is perhaps another double dividend that exists in the way we shape our recovery, is that the current recession is very abnormal as far as recessions go. It's an extremely female recession, and that's not what we usually see. Usually it's the jobs that are mostly occupied by men. Industrial jobs are the jobs that are lost the first in a recession. The current recession, which is caused by lockdowns, creates the exact opposite. It's service jobs that are getting shut down. It's schools that are getting shut down. It's hospital workers who are, well, they're working crazy, but some of them are not working because they're getting sick. So it's a very strange economic crisis. And logically, the response to such a crisis should also consider how different it is. That means that when we're thinking about investment, we should be thinking about more than just building stuff. We should be thinking, for instance, that education is definitely a form of investment. Public health is definitely a form of investment with very high returns. Culture, science, all of those things have essentially the same qualities as investments as building bridges or building roads. But one of the big differences that these investments have is that they're in sectors where women work much more than when you're building you're building buildings. So that's something that I think we should keep in mind when thinking about recovery plans. These are also sectors that have very much smaller environmental impacts than traditional industrial sectors. So having more of our social resources devoted to culture, science, education, and health probably makes us better societies, more happy societies, but also societies that rely much less on natural resources for their growth or for their well-being. So I think that's an aspect that we need to keep in mind when thinking about a green recovery. A green recovery is probably also a way to enhance gender equality as a very nice byproduct.
Thank you very much. Now we go to Quentin and then Elena.
Thank you very much. I think it's been said already a bit in the previous session, but the tension in the recovery right now is between building back quickly and building back better. And the way to address that for government, and you've seen that I have one focus on these two sessions, is to plan ahead, as Marta said, but also to be accountable as a government, being accountable to the public, because that spurs, acceptability for a range of tools in green fiscal changes and green fiscal reforms. And that is not only through carbon pricing, that's also through whatever investment the government is planning. So one example I wanted to talk about is the green budgeting that France just released. France is definitely not the first country to do it, but they're one of the first to actually communicate so broadly on it. And they're basically showing, out of our budget, this is how much contributes to green transition. This is how much basically is a barrier to green transition, and this is how much is neutral. And what's interesting is that they have, of course, they sort of tweak the numbers to have as little possible as investment that are considered as brand investment, but they still recognize that they have much to go to actually, phase out of fossil fuel subsidies. For instance, Karine Lepage was mentioning it on the previous session. France just announced that they will keep on funding subsidizing fossil fuel industries until 2035, so that's 15 years. But the major point in this is that most of their budget is deemed neutral. And we touched upon this before. Bailout conditionality, which is basically bailout for large corporation. We have fiscal space in France, so we're high-income countries. So there's a lot of response that includes tax breaks for large companies and direct subsidies. And putting strings attached, green conditionality is a way to actually shift the sort of neutral investments to green investments. And that's a way to go. And that's also a way to communicate to citizens how basically the government is planning to go ahead in the next 2, 5, 10 years, and perhaps make some of their decisions more understandable from the perspective of an average citizen.
Thank you very much. I think we go to Elena now.
Yes, thank you. I wanted to make a couple of points that, some of you made, but I feel are more general. The first point is that when we talk about future expenses for climate change adaptation or mitigation or disaster recovery, I think what is important to highlight, and maybe this is less specifically linked to fiscal policies and more in general to climate response, is that the revenues that we're raising now to mitigate or to adapt, they're not really something we're just doing. They are an insurance policy in a way to prevent us from incurring much lower costs in the future. So I think it is very useful to think about these issues really in terms of cost benefit and not just in terms of, cost or adaptation measures that we need to make to abide by some international agreement that our government happened to sign. And the economic instruments are the most cost-effective way to work towards these objectives and to raise revenues and to disincentivize certain behaviors, because they achieve behavioral change at the lowest social cost, and that means that revenues and just I'm missing the word, revenues and the capacity that we have in our economies can be used much more efficiently, and they can be used better. And in this moment of economic recession, that is extremely, extremely important. I think I think it was Antoine that also made a point about gender and how the pandemic is especially affecting women. And I think it's always useful to remind ourselves that climate change does affect women, particularly and more than men, for the simple reason that climate change generates insecurity, generates refugees, and women are much more exposed and much more vulnerable in this kind of situations where there is lack of security. So I think that is a really important point to keep in mind when we think about, you know, going forward and what we do in terms of creating these incentives to continue with carbon use, etc.
Thank you. I actually had missed a hot pursuit from Himanshu, and then we'll go to Grant, and then we're reaching the final words of wisdom if anyone has them.
Yeah, just wanted to push back slightly on what I think Santiago had said, or maybe I'm missing the name, about the tension between building back quicker and building back better. We've learned from the past recession and also from some of the policies that are being enacted now that there are some policies, for example, energy efficiency or retrofitting buildings, which can be implemented quite quickly and which can yield green dividends. But the question then is, are these policies going to deliver the kind of decarbonization we need in the long term? And there, these kind of policies fail. And that's what we also learned in the past recession, that these were seen as low-hanging fruits and they can be implemented quickly and deliver green benefits, but they haven't delivered the kind of decarbonization that you need in the long term. Yeah.
Just one quick addition to just to follow up of Antoine's remarks. The thing that I think we have to look forward to or think forward about is about these educational medical institutions also, and how they play a critical local role in the green recovery in terms of their physical footprint in local communities. But the second piece is, and this is something that we're really concerned about, is that there's also laggards in terms of their economic performance. So in the US context, hospitals and universities are not positive contributors to real estate taxation, which is one of our critical forms of revenue generation. So there's a tension there between kind of these institutions of higher education and medical supply. And effectively, what we've also seen is a massive retrenchment in the student supply. So that literal supply chain of students going to university has been disrupted. And as a result, that has a major implication on revenues at the local level, because you don't have people living in apartments and housing and spending in small business districts. So that kind of generation of economic well-being caused by the ed-med industrial complex is definitely feeling a tension within local governments right now.
If someone's inspired with, yes, please, Jacqueline.
I actually wanted to just comment on something that's been said a couple of times during this discussion very quickly, and that's the problem of falling revenue from environmental taxes, because I think quite a few people have mentioned this, and I don't think it should be left hanging at the end of our discussion this afternoon. Although obviously it's true for a carbon tax, what we're aiming for is that we don't have any revenue more from that tax. It's clearly also the case that that's a long-term problem on the one hand. On the second hand, you can address that quite well with tax design. So if you have a gradually increasing tax rate, you can compensate for the fact that your carbon is falling so that you can keep your revenues relatively stable as a good Ministry of Finance for at least the medium term. And then we can see as well that governments are very creative about finding new sources of taxation in the longer term. So I don't think this is a really big concern. We obviously shouldn't shift all our tax burden now onto environmental taxes, but I don't think there's a real concern there about falling revenues. I think this is another one of these. It's a bit of a misnomer. Just wanted to say that before the end.
I think Yvette wanted to hot pursue on that.
Yeah, just very quickly. Thank you, Jacqueline, for taking up that, because I was thinking the same. When we were talking previously about the political difficulty in introducing these environmental taxes, you can actually hit two flies in one bat with this. In Sweden, we normally introduce a lot of environmental taxes at a really low rate and then slowly, push it up. And then it will be politically okay. Public opinion and general opinion will also be okay with these taxes. And as you say, you compensate when you reduce the environmental impact and the tax revenue, it will still remain the same because you're pushing the rate up. So I think very good point by you.
And then Santiago, you have about 50 seconds.
Yes.
Marta, if you can.
Thank you very much. Thank you all. No, I think this is the time to really challenge a lot of what we have been doing, because it is evident that we are in a multiple crisis, and it's our economic system, the way we live. So let's be ambitious. Let's be really ambitious. Let's state the need for a change, and we need to do that now. And yes, there are different topics on the short-term decision making. That we know that green jobs can be created with less money invested, but anyhow, these decisions are not being taken. The green and just recovery narrative is already there. Everybody talks about that, but decisions are not there. So we need to understand how decision makers are acting, but we need to bring the large debate on the economy we have. Thank you.
Marta, you can try to squeeze something in.
Yes, very, very quick. We need flexibility to build back better, and we need not to forget the link between water, energy, and land. That's all.
I thank you everyone for participating. I've learned so much. I hope you have too. And keep thinking about that Apollo project and getting to the moon. Things are only impossible until they're not anymore, as Captain Picard said. Please keep on your good work.